Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents. This is the first installment of the Halloween series. There is some talk of death and spookiness, so I would be cautious with the easily spooked. Today we are back in the book of 25 ghost stories collected by W. Bob Holland. You remember those, right? Well, today, he's taking us to an old mansion in New Jersey. What happened to the old mansion? Well, are you ready to get spooky? Okay, let's begin. The Old Mansion. Down on the Jersey shore, that narrow strip of sand which stretches along the New Jersey coast, from Barnegat Inlet on the north to Little Egg Harbor Inlet on the south, are many a holiday maker. The summer traveler at one of the numerous resorts may, in wandering over to the sand dunes just across the bay from the village of Manahawkin, stumble over some of the charred timbers or vestiges of crumbling chimneys, showing that once, years back, a human habitation had stood there. If the find rouses the curiosity of the visitor enough to impel him to ask the weather-beaten old salt who sails on his fishing trips, he will learn that these relics mark the site of one of the first summer hotels erected on the New Jersey coast. That's where the old mansion stood, he will be informed by Captain Nate or Captain Sam, or whatever particular captain it may happen to be. And if by good fortune it happens to be Captain Jim, he will hear a story that will pleasantly pass away the long wait for the sheep's head bite. It was my good luck to have secured Captain Jim for a tutor in the angler's art during my vacation last summer, and his stories and reminiscences of Long Beach were not the least enjoyable features of the 2-week sojourn. Captain Jim was not garrulous. Few of the baymen are. They are a sturdy, self-reliant, and self-controlled people, full of strong common sense, but still with that firm belief in the supernatural which seems inherent in dwellers by the sea. "The old mansion," said Captain Jim, "or the Mansion of Health, for that was its full name, was built away back in 1822, or so I've heard my father say. There had been a tavern nearby the spot for years before that. It was kept by a man named Cranmer, and people used to come from Philadelphia by stagecoach, 60 miles through the pines to Hawkin, and then cross here by boat. Some would stop by Cranmer's, and others would go down to the beach on Homer's, which was clear down by the inlet. Finally, some of the wealthier people concluded that they wanted better accommodations than Cranmer gave, so they formed the Great Swamp Long Beach Company and built the Mansion of Health. I've heard that when it was built, it was the biggest hotel on the coast, and it was considered a wonder. It was 120 feet long, 3 stories high, and had a porch running all the way around it with a balcony on top. It was certainly a big thing in those days. I've heard Father tell many times of the stage loads of gay people that used to come rattling down to Hawkin, each stage drawn by 4 horses, and sometimes 4 or 5 of them in a day in the summer. A good many people, too, used to come down in their own carriages and leave them over on the mainland until they were ready to go home. There were gay times at the old mansion then, and it made times good for the people along the shore, too. How long did the old mansion flourish, Captain? I asked. Well, for 25 or 30 years, people came there summer after summer. Then they built a railroad to Cape May, and that, along with the ghosts, finished the Mansion of Health. What do you mean by ghosts? I demanded. Well, you see, said Captain Jim, cutting off a mouthful of navy plug, the story got around that the old house was haunted. Some people said that there were queer things to be seen there, and strange noises were heard that nobody could account for, and pretty soon the place got a bad name, and visitors were so few that it didn't pay to keep it open anymore. But how did it get the name of being haunted, Captain Jim? I persisted. Why, it was in this way, continued the mariner. Maybe you've heard of the time in the early 50s when a Powhatan was wrecked on the beach here, and every soul on board was lost. She was an immigrant ship, and there were over 400 people aboard, passengers and crew. She came ashore here during the mid-season storm in September. There weren't any life-saving stations in them days, and everybody was drowned. You can see the long graves now over in the Holland churchyard. Here the bodies were buried after they came ashore. They put them in 3 long trenches that were dug from one end of the burying ground to the other. The only people on the beach that night was the man who took care of the old mansion. He lived there with his family and his son-in-law. He was the wreckmaster for this part of the coast too. It wasn't until the second day that the people from Holland could get over to the beach, and by the time the bodies had all come ashore, and the wreckmaster had them all piled up on the sand. I was a youngster then, and came over with my father, and I tell you, it was the awfulest sight I ever saw. Them long rows of drowned people, all lying there with their white still faces turned up to the sky. Some were women, with their dead babies clasped tight in their arms, and some were husbands and wives, whose bodies came ashore locked together in a death embrace. I'll never forget that sight as long as I live. Well, the coroner came and took charge, and he began to inquire whether any money or valuables had been found, but the wreckmaster declared that not a single solitary coin had washed ashore. People thought this was rather singular, as the immigrants were, most of them, well-to-do Germans, who were known to have brought a good deal of money with them. But it was concluded that that had gone down with the ship. Well, the poor immigrants were given a pauper's burial, and the people had begun to forget their suspicions, until 3 or 4 months later when there came another storm, and the sea broke clear over the beach, just below the old mansion, and washed away the sand. Early the next morning, 2 men from Holland sailed across the bay and landed on the beach. They walked across on the hard bottom where the sea had washed across, and when they were about halfway from the bay, one of the men saw something curious up against the stump of an old cedar tree. He called the other man's attention to it, and then went over to the stump. What they found was a pile of leather money belts that would have filled a wheelbarrow. Every one of them was cut open and empty. They had been buried in the sand by the old stump, and the sea had washed away the covering. The men didn't go any further. They carried the belts back to their boats and sailed back to Holland as fast as the wind could take them. Of course, it made a big sensation, and everybody was satisfied that the wreckmaster had robbed the bodies, if he hadn't done anything worse. But there was no way to prove it, and so nothing was done. The wreckmaster didn't stay around long after that. The people made it too hot for him, and he and his family went away south, where it was said that they bought a big plantation and a lot of slaves. Years afterward, the story came to Holland somehow that he was killed in a barroom brawl, and that his son-in-law was drowned by his boat upsetting while he was out fishing. I couldn't furnish any affidavits for that part of the story, though. However, after that, nobody lived in the old mansion for a long time. People would go there, stay a week or 2, and leave, and at last it was given up entirely to beach parties in the daytime and ghosts at night. But, Captain, you don't really believe in the ghost part, do you? I asked. Captain Jim looked down the bay, coughed up a shoreman's oyster over the side of the boat, and answered slowly, "Well, I don't know as I would have believed in 'em if I hadn't seen the ghost." "What?" I exclaimed. "You saw it? Tell me about it. I've always wanted to see a ghost, or the next best thing, a man who has seen one." "It was August about 1861, said the captain. "I was a young feller then, with a half a dozen more over on the beach cutting salt hay. We didn't come home at nights, but did our own cooking in the old mansion kitchen, and at night slept on piles of hay upstairs. We were a reckless bunch of scamps, and reckoned that no ghost could scare us. There was a big full moon that night, and it was as light as day. The mosquitoes were pretty bad too, and it was easier to stay awake than to go to sleep. Along toward midnight, me and 2 other fellers went out onto the old balcony, and began to race around the house. We hollered and yelled and chased each other for half an hour or so. And then we concluded we had better go to sleep. So we started for the window of the room where the rest were. This window was near one end on the ocean side, and as I came around the corner, I stopped as if I'd been shot, and my hair raced straight up on top of my head. Right there in front of that window stood a woman looking out over the sea, and in her arms she held a little child. I saw her as plain as I see you now. It seemed to me like an hour she stood there, but I don't suppose it was a second. And then she was gone. When I could move, I looked around for the other boys, and they were standing there paralyzed. They had seen the woman too. We didn't say much, and we didn't sleep much that night, and the next night we bunked out on the beach. The rest of the crowd made all manner of fun of us, but we had all the ghosts we wanted, and I never set foot inside that old house after that. "When did it burn down, Captain?" I asked Jim as he relapsed into silence. "Somewhere about 25 years ago. A beach party had been roasting clams in the old oven, and somehow the fire got into the woodwork and it was dry as tinder, and I hope the ghosts were burnt up with it." The end. Well, I like this story. It was a bit hard trying to come up with an accurate accent for the captain, so I hope I didn't butcher it too badly. Thank you for listening, and if you want more creepy stuff, check out Ye Old Crime Podcast. Thank you, and happy Halloween.